Okay, false start. Let's get started. So I'm going to pose a question to you. How do we know if pesticides are safe to use? And I'd suggest that one reason we might be assured of some element of safety is that all pesticides have to go through a comprehensive process when they become registered by the US EPA. And it's not a once and done deal. Every 15 years, pesticides have to go through a re-registration process. And each time, the EPA is going to require quite a bit of scientific data, toxicological, ecotoxicological, residue analysis, environmental fate, just to list a few of the types of data that the EPA is going to use in more than the shown here, but the most two important types of assessments that I want to point out are the human health risk assessment and the ecological risk assessments that the EPA does on every registered product. Basically, the data has to demonstrate that the product will not cause unreasonable risk to human health or the environment when used according to the label. So, I'm asking you, does this guarantee that the pesticide is safe to use? What do you think? Okay, I see a few heads shaking no. And that's what I wanted you to think. What do you think? Cornball slide alert. Actually, this isn't the cornball slide alert. This is the one designed to shake you up. So no, it does not guarantee the product's safe to use, because if not used according to the label, that is the real important part of that sentence, that it can be misused and it can be unsafe. So what the pesticide label does tell us about relative to safety is contained in that signal word. The signal word indicates acute toxicity, which is short-term toxicity. So harmful effects that occur within either immediately or 24 to 48 hours. And this is, I'm sure, a review for you, but there's 3 signal words that can correspond to 4 acute toxicity categories. And a real important point is when you look at that signal word, it's not just representing the active ingredient acute toxicity, it's the acute toxicity of that formulated product. That's why you can have multiple formulations of one active ingredient, and they can have actually different signal words. It's based on the product, which makes a lot of sense because that's what you're using. I want to point out that the pesticide label gives you absolutely no information on the potential long-term harmful effects. We call those chronic effects. However, the EPA, when registering a product, does look at both acute and chronic effects, which is pretty important. And just an example of a pesticide label, and I'm sure you've all noted these signal words before. Furthermore, looking at some of the products or actives that are, actually these are products, trade names that are used in mosquito control, I just pulled out to give you a not comprehensive list in any sort of way, but just to give you a feel for the range in acute toxicities, and the products you're working with, of course, range anywhere from practically non-toxic to highly toxic. With the larvicides, I've noted that most of those fall into the caution rating. So most products overall are falling in the caution, with a few exceptions. Okay, if you were to want more information on chronic or long-term toxicity, you could get that information from the SDS, the safety data sheet. The pesticide label is written for the user. There's information on the safe and effective use of that product, but there's not every possible piece of information regarding the toxicity. So if you were to want more information about long-term toxicity, this is what I would direct you to. And as I'm sure you know, your employers are required to make these available to you. And that's true of any hazardous substance, so pesticides are just one small subset of possible hazardous substances in the workplace. And here's where you would go to, section 11 on that SDS sheet. Okay, so we've been talking all this time about toxicity, which is the potential for harmful effects. What I'd like to point out is that your actual risk of coming to harm from the use of a pesticide is not just about the acute toxicity. After all, if that pesticide's just sitting on the, what I almost said didn't, okay, it's just sitting on the shelf unopened, there's really very little risk, right? So exposure. Now I want you to think about that exposure component to your risk. And of course, we're going to talk about more practical things you can do to lower your exposure. So the pesticide label is written for the user to mitigate the risk of using that pesticide. So mitigate, lessen, or make less harmful. And I just have an example of a PPE statement, which I'm sure you can't read from the back of the room, but PPE being the #1 way that risk is mitigated. Okay, here's my cornball slide. I was getting a little anxious there at the beginning. So I'm going to tell you to read the label. Yes, I am. If not for your sake, then because someone wants you home tonight. You're all supposed to go, "Aw." Too early, right? Okay, so #1, wear the required PPE. And for professional products, with only one exception I've ever seen, the bare minimum is going to be the long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes and socks, and then of course, depending upon the product, there can be more PPE required. And in some cases, there's requirements to have an enclosed cab. In that case, you have to have the required PPE. I should back up for a second. If you are making an application within an enclosed cab, there's still going to be a minimum PPE requirement for that, but the full PPE must be available sitting there inside the cab in case you have to exit the cab during the application. Okay, now some practical tips for pesticide applicators. The importance of inspecting PPE that is worn, reused, to make sure that it's free of holes and not cracked and damaged. Good tip for gloves is just to dip them in a bucket of water. Now I come to the part about respirator use. And once again, I've looked at a number of pesticides used in mosquito control, and there's definitely some materials there that require the respirator for mixing and loading. So just to remind people that employers have the responsibility for making sure that anyone that's using a respirator has had an initial medical evaluation. And the reason for this is that respirators can put a lot of, can stress your cardiopulmonary system and can be harmful to people's health if they have issues with hearts, lungs, etc. So the initial medical evaluation can be as simple as taking an online survey. But if the survey reveals underlying problems, then it may be necessary to see a doctor to see if that person can actually wear that respirator. Annual fit testing is also required, and this is not the same thing as a seal check. This is typically going to be administered at a health clinic, or occupational health clinic, something like that. Training in the care of use is required, and then the employer has to keep records of compliance. Now, some pesticide applicators prefer to wear a respirator even if it's not required by the pesticide label, and there's requirements for that as well. The employer has to make sure that person has that initial medical evaluation, that respirator won't be stressing their health, and ensure that the mask is kept in sanitary condition. By the way, these are all OSHA requirements with respect to the respirator. Just going to show you some examples of respirators. You have to read the language carefully on the pesticide label to know what kinds you need. And I would encourage you, if someone working for you or you aren't sure what kind of respirator is required, give my office a call. We can help with respirator selection. So just from left to right, I've shown some examples with increasing amount of protection, starting with the filtering facepiece respirator. Yes, in some situations, these disposable respirators can suffice. This is just removing particulates. In the middle is a half-face elastomeric mask with particulate filters. And then on the right, there's both the particulate filters as combined with the organic vapor cartridge in a half mask. Okay, moving on. This question popped up, I think, about 2 years ago when I was speaking with this group, and it was brought to my attention that when we calibrate it with equipment, oftentimes the actual product is used for ULV calibrations, and the question was, should we wear more PPE? Well, certainly I would if this mist were blowing in my face. This might be a situation where you'd voluntarily wear a respirator. Any other type of situation where you expect more than routine exposure. Perhaps the wind is blowing it back in your face, something like that. And don't forget that when your people are repairing equipment, they need to protect themselves too. Follows user safety precautions. All professional labels have the user safety precautions on them. Essentially, seems like common sense, but when we're done applying pesticides, we should wash thoroughly before engaging in any of these activities. If the pesticide gets in your clothing, you're going to want to have spare clothing available so that you can wash it and change. Don't ever do any of these dumb things. Okay, I admit we set up these shots, okay? This is an important one, to be prepared to wash up in the field. Okay, so we got those user safety precautions, and you're working out in the field. We don't always have a convenient restroom available to us, so that is why you need to have soap, water, and towels on that truck, and the spare clothing. Also, if someone's working with a pesticide that has eye protection as one of the required PPE, it's an OSHA requirement to have the eye solution. And hand sanitizer does not suffice for washing up. It's not going to provide the rinsing action to remove the pesticide residues. If you've been making applications through the day, you come home or get back to the shop, you're going to want to remove the clothing you wore before you relax at the end of the day. Just keep in mind that there's going to be pesticide residues on the clothing, and pesticide residues can be transferred to your carpeting, to your upholstery, etc. So definitely remove clothing, your work clothing, at the end of the day. Then the other point in this slide is to launder the work clothes separately from the family wash. Pesticides, research has shown, can transfer from one item to clothing to another, so it doesn't make sense to wash them with other people's clothing. Okay, the last few safety slides deal with recognizing pesticide poisoning and heat stress symptoms. So starting out with pesticide poisoning, nausea, vomiting, muscle aches, cramps, diarrhea, headache, dizziness. Does this sound like anything else to you? Anybody? It's kind of a quiet audience. Yes? Heat exhaustion? Well, possibly, yeah. Definitely the headache and dizziness part. What else could it be confused with? Well, yeah, the heart attack, I was going to ask you the same question with the chest pains, difficulty breathing, et cetera, and all. That sounds more like heart attack. And the first few symptoms sound a lot like flu, right? Or now COVID. So one of the points is that pesticide poisoning symptoms, which you see here, can be confused with other things pretty readily. But of course, If someone experienced these things and been applying pesticides, then you know to consider that as one of the possible issues. Also, pesticides that are caustic can cause the skin rash, or I don't think I have it on the slide, but burning and damage to the skin. All right, moving. If you happen to be the first responder in an event where someone has been exposed to pesticides, certainly if they have any of the serious symptoms that we looked at in the previous slide, you're going to want to seek medical attention right away. But the general steps are, of course, to get the person away from the site of exposure, keeping yourself safe at the same time, seeking medical help, and then checking the label or the SDS for anything that needs to be immediately done. For example, something you would need to do right away would be to flush the eyes in the case of getting the pesticide in their eyes. It's important to take the label or the SDS to the doctor or the medical professional because there's specific information on that label about treating that person in the first aid section. Okay, what about heat stress? Okay, what is heat stress? And the body becomes has increasing difficulty in cooling itself and begins to overheat. Some of the things that can make it worse, of course, are the PPE when worn in hot and humid weather. And heat stress can progress to heat stroke, which of course can be life-threatening. Common symptoms, the headache, the dizziness, the confusion, heavy sweating, or in real extreme cases, lack of sweating, skin clammy and wet, or extreme cases dry because the body no longer can deal with the heat load. Thirst, certainly, and then chest pains, breathing difficulty, muscle aches, loss of consciousness in the worst case. So first aid for heat stress, obviously get the person into a cool, shaded area. The PPE, if that's, remove the PPE, splash them with cool water. If possible, have them drink cool water and get help. Any questions about the safety part of the presentation? I'm going to move into, I think the next part is a label update. Yeah. I mean, I would think of those as being something that would be an aid, but not really a substitute for. Yeah. Okay. I mean, the rinsing action is what really helps. Thank you. Sure. Okay. With that re-registration process, the EPA plans to mitigate risks to non-target species. So non-target species and endangered species is kind of a renewed emphasis of EPA. They focused on human safety for a very long time, perhaps not looking at non-target effects quite as much. So in the last couple years, they're really looking at pesticide labels and looking at the impact. And as I already mentioned, the pesticides have to be reviewed every 15 years. Endangered species is a new priority, as I've already said. This is on endangered species, and I have to introduce Bolton's Live 2. So Bolton's Live 2 is a site now that some pesticide labels with potential ESA impact will direct you to by giving you the website, and it will also have an alternative telephone number that can be called. So what are you going to do with this bulletin? It's a requirement that you actually go to the bulletin and look for pesticide use limitations. And I'm going to show you basically step by step how that works. So thank you very much. So this is an example of where I just typed in my address, a certain pesticide, et cetera, and what it does is pull up a map, and it will pull up a pesticide use limitation if there is one. And this is an example of the POLA, so to speak. This is another one that I typed in. This is a agricultural herbicide in Summit County, Ohio, and a certain month of the year, I think it was May, and the limitation language is all written there on the right. It tells you what your constraints are when you are applying that pesticide in that location. It is a requirement, and for you to actually go through this procedure, and as evidence in complying, what I suggest you do is actually print out the PDF and just keep it with your pesticide records. On the rodenticides, I'm going to talk about those to tell you what some of the proposed changes are. But this is a really good example because one of the proposed changes is that they will have endangered species language on these labels that will require you to go through the process that I just described. So the proposed label changes, these are not finalized yet, are geared towards mitigating risks, both human health as well as endangered species. And it just involves restricted use products that are anticoagulants, with the exception of first generation products in small packaging. But all other anticoagulant rodenticides are under this review and proposed changes. So the second bullet point is they are talking about requiring chemical resistant gloves and a PF10 respirator. Third point is the requirement to collect and dispose of all kills. And then the fourth point, which we've already discussed, is that you will be required to consult Bolton's Lib 2 for any pesticide use limitations. And what the likely requirement would be is if you are within an endangered species area, that you would have to use the rodenticides within bait stations. Any questions about Bolton's Live or the rodenticides? Okay, yes.
We think you're going to mean by collection disposal of all kills. I mean, when we go out and bait an area, we don't always go back. Sometimes we go back. We're not going to continue to go back until residents need to dispose of them on their own. If they can find them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what makes these proposed changes kind of controversial, is it would require you to go back and look for the kills. So just to explain the reasoning for that, so one of the issues with endangered species is consuming the rodenticide treated or kills, okay, because of the problem with when the predator species eats the rat, it's likely to be killed. So that's the reasoning behind that. I mean, that's the only comment I really have. Just as a practical question, how much does the use of the type of secure bait box help? The dead rodent still can freely leave that or not? Okay. Yes, question.
That's only for anticoagulants, though, right? Not other types of rodenticides. All rodenticides.
That's my understanding, is it's the anticoagulant baits. But I'm not 100% on that. There is you can easily go to the EPA website and get a complete rundown on these. It's the proposed interim decision, if you want to write that down. So when the EPA makes an interim decision, it sounds kind of like it's one step along the way, right? An interim decision, the way I've come to understand it, is more or less like their final decision. A proposed interim decision is what they put out there for the public to comment on, and then when they finally make their what they don't call a final decision, it's the interim decision. So it's a very long process from them making a proposal to the actual adoption, if that makes any sense. But you can go out on their website and look that up, proposed interim decision rodenticide. Oh, I didn't even talk about the bilingual labels. Let me just mention, it was just an FYI, so that by 2030, EPA is proposing to add Spanish language translation to all pesticide labels. Interestingly enough, it's not the complete label that they're requiring it for, it's certain sections of it. So that is something that is coming down the pike. All right, I just have a few more label things I wanted to point out that I think of interest for this group. So I'm going to focus a little bit on adulticides used in mosquito control for public health and vector control. They're kind of unique among pesticides, and I want to point out why that is as I go along here. One of the things is the wind speed restrictions on these adulticide products. This is just some example language on a label. Apply when the wind exceeds 1 mile per hour. Do not apply when the wind exceeds 10 miles per hour. Now that's not so strange yet, but a temperature inversion is preferable to keep the fog close to the ground. Okay, so I have a few slides here to explain why that is. And to do so, I have borrowed some colleagues' slides that cover exactly what a temperature inversion is. And at the end, I'm going to say why we are applying adulticides under these conditions. So what exactly is a temperature inversion and how does it develop? Well, oftentimes starts the preceding day when we have typically a nice sunny day or at least a warm day where we have radiant energy from the sun warming the earth. Under these conditions, these are not inversion conditions because as you can imagine, when warm air rises, right? So we have warm air at the surface of the earth because it's heating from the radiant energy, and we get a mixing of air layers, okay? Later, when we no longer have the solar radiation warming the surface of the earth, the ground actually can emit more energy than it receives, so the ground becomes cool at this point. Now, if there's a lot of cloud cover, this is going to be reduced. Okay, the effect is going to be strongest on cool, clear nights. So this is setting up the situation that's perfect for an inversion. You have cooler air below warmer air. It's cooler because remember the surface of the earth radiated out energy towards essentially space. So the perfect conditions for inversions are what I'm showing here. And it's also important that there's light winds. So clear light winds. In the evening, we're going to set up the conditions for inversions. And cool air doesn't rise, right? So we talk about the cold air being trapped at the surface of the earth. The meteorologists tell me that's not quite the way to describe it. It's more like a gradient from cool to warm. So this cold air layer can actually move across the land horizontally. And the fog shown here, it's a great way to think about how these inversion works, but obviously the same thing can happen with a cloud of fine pesticide droplets. Here's, it's actually done with a tracer dye. So this could be a layer of pesticide droplets just as well as a tracer dye. Okay, so let's go back to spraying with adulticides. You are making applications preferably during conditions that keep that fog moving and close to the ground when conditions are actually conducive to drift. Okay, so that's why I mentioned at the very beginning of this is that adulticide for vector control is unique and it contrasts with what other pesticide applicators want to do. They don't want to apply during inversions. In fact, herbicides in agriculture, it states clearly, do not apply under inversion conditions. Just a few more points about adulticide spraying. Your goal is not to have those droplets depose on surfaces. Those tiny droplets are supposed to float through the air and contact the mosquitoes and kill them on contact. And that's why it's so important to calibrate your equipment so that your droplets are in that very fine, whatever range of sizes, so they don't depose on surfaces. And third point, your AI per acre is extremely low, and the materials that are used are not designed to have residual. Now, spraying for backyard mosquitoes, nuisance mosquito control, or barrier applications for other purposes are kind of totally the opposite scenario. Drift away from the property is not acceptable. Okay, unlike the vector control, it kind of drifts through the whole neighborhood, and that's really what you're trying to do. The other point is that deposition on the target surface is really what's intended with barrier control. Usually they're using a residual material, and you want to have it land on the surfaces where the mosquitoes are resting. The goal is not to kill them in flight. Oftentimes the AI is much higher, and since these products have residual control, that's why there is the concern with pollinators and the importance of not treating blooming crops or blooming plants and blooming weeds. Okay, so this slide is actually, when I say recent, I think a couple years old, but I'll just point out some of the cases that the ODA has had with mosquito applications. Not surprisingly, drift to neighboring properties is one of the key complaints. Application to the wrong property, that happens pretty often with lawn care and mosquito control and things like that, surprisingly. And then another thing you don't want to do, of course, is fill your equipment with the wrong pesticide. So that's pretty disastrous, and that's what's shown here. Okay. That's it for that section of my presentation. So I have the quiz now for you to have a look at. And I'll give you the instructions for that. And if there's any questions about this presentation, I also can handle the questions while people are taking a look at the quiz. How about I give you, since there's only about 15 minutes left, about 6 or 7 minutes to look at that quiz and try to get through it, and then we'll discuss some of them really quick. Okay, everybody, that was almost 15 minutes, which is a little better than 7. So let's go ahead and pick this up and have a look at it. And by the way, I'll just mention that I would appreciate if you guys would do the evaluation at the end of here. It's a QR code that you can scan with your phone, and it goes to just like a 1-minute survey on the presentation. So I appreciate you doing that. Okay, so let's take a look at these questions, and I'll just point out that I picked 2 very different products here. One, kind of your classic adulticide for mosquito control, for vector control, and then Maverick Perimeter, much different product, which would be used to control a much wider array of insects, potentially in a situation like a residence or commercial property. Okay, starting with number 1, what information from the label is required for your commercial pesticide applicator record? Anyone? Pardon me? No, I'm asking, okay, so a commercial pesticide record, which I did not review in my presentation, what are 2 items found on the label that go on that record? Name of the product, and I'm sorry, what? EPA registration number, bingo. And I usually tell people to look on the front panel for the EPA registration number, but this one was found on the second page. So now I'm going to say it's usually on the first or second page. Okay, what's the signal word on this pesticide? Caution. And anybody, what does that mean? What's the tox class? Does anybody recall? Slightly or practically non-toxic. I'll go ahead and give you that one. Okay, what is the required PPE for this product? Just go ahead and shout it out. Coveralls. Long sleeve shirt, shoes and long pants, shoes and socks. Okay, what else? Chemical resistant gloves. Wait a minute, was protective eyewear on there? I didn't see that. Okay. Okay, yep. And then the respirator. Okay, very interesting. And I want to point out the respirator with an R or P filter. A lot of times it will say an NR or P filter. It'll give you all three options, but this only gives you two, and there's actually an important reason for that. So first of all, R means, so P, let me start with P, is oil proof, R is oil resistant, and N filter is non-oil resistant. So real important to know that you have what type of filter you need to use this or to mix and load this pesticide. It is a product that is oil soluble. It's not a water soluble material, so those little droplets are going to be essentially little oil droplets. Important to have the right type of filter on your respirator. Okay, what kind of modification may be required, notification, put the glasses back on, may be required under Ohio pesticide law for this product? Anybody?
Isn't it like before the first application you're supposed to see if any other requirements exist?
I was actually looking for something very specific. This is a hard question, and it wasn't in my presentation either.
We thought it might be notifying the apiaries because it says you can apply if there's a public health issue.
Yeah, so that is true, that there's kind of like an exemption for public health. But typically, if it were not a public health situation with the documentation and all of that, this type of product, because the label says that it is toxic to bees or pollinators, then that part of Ohio pesticide law kicks in that you're required to notify apiaries within a half a mile, registered apiaries. Okay, why is application during a temperature inversion with light wind preferred? Okay, so I did talk about that in the presentation. Anybody? Keep it close to the ground, yep, and keep it, you said drift, but keep it moving and keep it close to the ground. Light wind keeps it moving, the inversion keeps it close to the ground. Okay, can you apply this product to agricultural land? Okay, so no, it does, it's kind of clear that you're not supposed to apply it to cropland. It says it's used in non-crop land. What must you do with equipment annually? Calibrate it. Okay, so what is the calibration? What does that essentially do? It's all about droplet size. You've got to make sure you got the appropriate droplet size. Once again, with mosquito adulticizing, it's the size of droplet that is going to form that fog and encounter those mosquitoes in flight. If the drops are too big, what are they going to do? They're going to depose on surfaces, right? And that's really not what we want to do. Ideally, the little droplets kind of like evaporate after they do their job. That's just how a physicist would describe it, I'm sure. Okay, let's move on to Maverick Perimeter. Does this product allow for any public health threat exemptions? Why or why not? And what I mean by the public health exemptions is that language like you mentioned that says, you must do this blah, 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 unless there's a documented health threat. Okay, so does it or does it not? Anybody? Okay, no. Okay, it's pretty clear. I mean, it says do not apply where bees are active. There's no exception, okay? Annual rates can be exceeded for public health threat. There's nothing like that, okay? Which actually that statement is in the mosquito mist that you can exceed the rates for public health threat, but nothing like that in Maverick Perimeter. It also says do not apply under conditions that favor drift. Okay, what are the options for disposing of this pesticide? Yeah, pretty limited, right? Got to use it according to label or then otherwise find some waste disposal facility or some public program. And while ODA does have a public program for pesticide waste disposal, unfortunately it is for private applicators essentially. It's for farmers and growers. Okay, how long do you have to keep people out of treated areas? Yep, until the spray is dried. How much Maverick would you need to mix 3 gallons of spray at the high rate for ticks? I heard somebody say it. So you have to find ticks in the table, right? And then what was the high rate? Anybody? 0.1, so 0.0 or 0.3 fluid ounces is the answer. Okay, here's a question for you. Can you apply this product with ULV equipment? Well, actually, yes, it is implied in that one statement on the right-hand side of the right-hand column. It says, when using cold foggers or other ULV delivery systems, but what's very curious to me is it's clear as mud what rate you would use. So when I was reading this label, I was kind of like, huh? So I would not want to be using it unless I talk to the manufacturer or the technical specialist about that. Okay. Final question, can you allow the spray cloud from a ULV application to drift onto the neighbor's yard? No, okay, so clearly not. So I've set up the contrast between the two different types of products and the language on the label. That concludes my presentation. If you would be so kind to do that brief evaluation, I'd appreciate it. Are there any questions? Yes.
I guess I'm very confused about the waste disposal facility requirement. So, is there some kind of record keeping that you have to maintain to show that you took it to like a landfill or program?
The question was is it a requirement to keep records of how you disposed of pesticides? I mean, there's no chain of custody requirement. Would it be a good idea to keep that record as a business or government entity? It would be a good idea. And by the way, where are these hazardous waste facilities? ODA keeps a list of hazardous waste disposal companies. So if you're ever like in need of one, ODA can send you that list. And unfortunately, it's an expensive service. It is not cheap to dispose of pesticides. But that is clearly really the only other option besides using it as according to the label or as a registered use. Thank you very much for your attention. The last thing is I have those respirator manuals. If anyone would like one, just put up your hand and I'll give you a copy. Thanks very much.